Hello, and welcome to Mythos and Logos. Imagine a civilization so powerful that its monuments would stand for 3,000 years, yet so fragile that it vanished in a single generation. Picture an interconnected world of palace complexes and trade routes spanning from the tin mines of Afghanistan to the amber shores of the Baltic Sea, a Bronze Age system of such sophistication that nothing like it would exist again for nearly a millennium. Now imagine that same world brought to its knees, not by plague or natural disaster alone, but by mysterious warriors who appeared from the sea, left their mark in blood and ash, and then seemingly dissolved into history itself. They built no cities, left no writings, erected no monuments to their victories. We know them only through the terrified accounts of their victims and the triumphant inscriptions of the one power that managed to survive their onslaught. They are the Sea Peoples, and they remain one of archaeology's most enduring mysteries. Tonight, we will journey back over 3,000 years to witness the death throes of the late Bronze Age. We will stand with Ramesses III as black sails appear on the horizon of the Nile Delta. We will explore the burned ruins of once mighty Ugarit, where desperate clay tablets were fired by the very flames that consumed the city. Our investigation will take us from the Nuragic towers of Sardinia to the fallen palaces of Mycenaean Greece, from the drought-stricken highlands of Anatolia to the fortified settlements of Cyprus. Together, we will piece together what modern archaeology, genetic science, and climatology can tell us about these enigmatic invaders who may have been as much victims as destroyers in one of history's greatest catastrophes. If this content resonates with you, please show your support with a like and subscribe. It's incredibly encouraging and helps me reach more people. I'm always interested in the diverse community we have here. Share your location and current time in the comments if you'd like to connect. Feel the present gently dissolve as history opens its arms to welcome you into the sultry heat of an Egyptian afternoon in 1177 BC. The air shimmers above the papyrus marshes of the delta. Ibises wade through the shallows, their calls echoing across waters that have nourished this land since time immemorial. The scent of river mud mingles with burning incense from a nearby temple where priests maintain their eternal vigils. This is Egypt, at the tail end of its new kingdom glory, still mighty, still proud, but sensing somehow that the world beyond its borders has begun to shift and crack like sun-baked clay. In the royal palace at Medinet Habu, scribes carve urgent hieroglyphs into stone, recording for all eternity what may be the last great victory of the pharaonic age. For on this day, strange ships have been sighted approaching the river mouths, their prows carved with unfamiliar beasts, their sails dark against the afternoon sun, and upon their decks stand warriors unlike any the Egyptians have faced before. Part 1. The Mystery Unveiled. The ships with black sails. The morning mist clung to the waters of the Nile Delta like a burial shroud, and through it came death. In the year 1177 BC, the scribes of Ramesses III recorded what would become one of the most significant naval battles in ancient history. But this was no ordinary military engagement between rival powers. This was something altogether more unsettling, more primal. The ships that emerged from the fog that day bore no standards of known nations, flew no colours of established kingdoms. Their warriors wore no uniform dress, carried no matching shields. They were, in the words carved deep into the walls of Medinet Habu, a confederation of the displaced, the desperate, and the determined. The Egyptian lookouts stationed at the river mouths would have seen them first, sleek vessels with high prows, carved into serpents and birds of prey, nothing like the reed boats that plied these waters daily. The oars moved in perfect synchronization, cutting through the sacred waters of the Nile with an urgency that spoke of long practice and grim purpose. Upon the decks stood warriors, whose appearance defied categorization. Some wore the feathered headdresses that swept back from their brows like exotic plumes. Others bore horned helmets that caught the morning sunday. Their round shields gleamed with bronze studs, and their long swords hung at their sides, not the curved khopesh blades favoured by Egyptian soldiers, but straight, deadly instruments, designed for a different kind of warfare entirely. As word reached the pharaoh in his palace at Medinet Habu, the massive war machine of Egypt stirred to life. Ramesses III was no stranger to conflict. His father, Setnakte, had fought a civil war to claim the throne and establish the 20th dynasty. The son had inherited both his father's military acumen and his paranoia. For years, reports had been filtering in from the edges of the empire. Cities burned in distant lands, whole peoples on the move. The great Hittite Empire to the north, which had once stood as Egypt's equal, had fallen silent. The last desperate messages from Ugarit spoke of enemy ships patrolling the coast at will. Now those same ships had come to Egypt. What followed was not merely a battle but a collision of worlds. The Egyptian forces, still clinging to the chariot warfare that had dominated battlefields for centuries, met an enemy that fought on foot with a mobility and ferocity they had never encountered. The reliefs at Medinet Habu, carved with propagandistic fervour but revealing in their details, show Egyptian archers raining arrows from the riverbanks, while their ships formed a wooden wall across the delta channels. The invaders fought with a desperate courage, born of having nowhere to retreat. Behind them lay only the sea and the ruins of the world they had helped destroy. Ahead lay the richest land in the known world, if only they could take it. The pharaoh would claim total victory, as pharaohs always did. 6,000 enemies dead, their bodies piled like cordwood, their severed hands collected as grisly trophies. But the very fact that Ramesses felt compelled to record this battle in such monumental detail, covering entire walls with its depiction, suggests something more than routine military triumph. This was existential survival. Egypt had looked into the abyss that had swallowed the rest of the Bronze Age world, and had somehow, barely, impossibly, stepped back from the edge. A world before the storm. To understand what arrived on Egypt's shores that day, you must first understand what was lost. Close your eyes and imagine yourself a merchant in the year 1300 BC. Your ship, laden with copper ingots from Cyprus, tin from distant Afghanistan, and purple dye from the Levantine coast, follows routes that your grandfather's grandfather once sailed. In your cargo hold rest ivory tusks from Nubia, amber from the far Baltic, and delicate pottery from Mycenaean workshops. You speak 4 languages fluently and can haggle in 3 more. The world is vast but connected, bound together by invisible threads of commerce and diplomacy that span from the British Isles to the Indus Valley. This was the late Bronze Age at its zenith, a cosmopolitan world that would not be matched again until the height of the Roman Empire over a millennium later. Great kings addressed each other as brothers in correspondence, their clay tablets crisscrossing continents in diplomatic pouches. The Amarna letters, discovered in the ruins of Akhenaten's abandoned capital, preserve nearly 300 such messages. They speak of trade agreements and marriage alliances, of mutual defense pacts and careful territorial negotiations. The king of Babylon complains that the gold sent by Egypt is of poor quality. The king of Assyria bristles at perceived slights to his ambassadors. The governor of Byblos pleads for military assistance against local rebels. It is a world instantly recognizable in its political complexity, its economic interdependence, its petty jealousies and grand ambitions. The wealth that flowed through this system defied imagination. A single shipwreck discovered off the coast of Turkey, at Uluburun, contained enough raw materials to equip an entire army, 10 tons of copper, 1 ton of tin, enough to forge thousands of bronze weapons. But also luxuries, gold jewellery, ivory cosmetic boxes, ebony logs from tropical Africa, turquoise from the Sinai, glass ingots in cobalt blue and turquoise. The loss of just this one vessel represented a fortune that could bankrupt kingdoms. Yet ships like this plied the Mediterranean regularly, their safe passage guaranteed by the stable powers that controlled the sea lanes. Palace complexes dominated this world, at Knossos and Pylos, at Hattusha and Ugarit, at Thebes and Babylon. Great administrative centres controlled vast agricultural hinterlands. Armies of scribes recorded every transaction, every tax payment, every distribution of grain from the royal storehouses. These were not merely political capitals, but economic engines, drawing in raw materials from across the known world and transforming them into the prestige goods that marked civilization itself. A Mycenaean lord could drink wine from a golden cup, its design influenced by Minoan artisans, its gold mined in Nubia, its wine grown from vines, originally cultivated in the Caucasus. He could dress in linen from Egypt, dyed with purple from Phoenician shores, fastened with pins of Baltic amber set in Cypriot copper. The warriors who maintained this order fought from chariots, the supreme military technology of the age. A pair of horses, bred and trained at enormous expense, pulled a lightweight car of bent wood and leather. Upon it stood two men, a driver and an archer, both armoured in bronze scales that could turn aside most weapons of the day. Chariot forces were small, elite, expensive to maintain. A major kingdom might field a few thousand at most. Battles were often predetermined affairs, fought at agreed-upon locations, more like elaborate duels than the total warfare that would come later. The palace controlled the means of producing bronze weapons, maintained the chariot corps, paid the professional soldiers. Without the palace, military power simply dissolved. Names carved in stone. The Egyptian scribes who recorded the invasion for posterity were meticulous in their documentation. These were not vague barbarian hordes, but specific peoples with specific names carved into stone with the same precision used to record the genealogies of gods. The Peleset, whose feathered headdresses gave them an almost mythical appearance. The Cheka, bearing round shields and short swords. The Denyen, whose name echoed something familiar from the Aegean world. The Weshesh, about whom almost nothing else would survive. The Shekelesh, described as circumcised sea wanderers, and returning from earlier invasions, the Sherden with their distinctive horned helmets, and the Lukka, professional pirates from the Anatolian coast. But names alone tell only part of the story. The reliefs at Medinet Habu reveal something far more significant than a simple raid for plunder. Behind the warriors come ox carts laden with women and children, with household possessions and agricultural tools. These were not merely pirates or mercenaries, but entire populations on the move. The Egyptian artists, trained to depict enemies in standardized ways, struggled to capture the diversity of their opponents. Some wear kilts in the Aegean style, others sport the leather armour of Anatolian highlanders. Their hairstyles range from the long locks of the West to the shaved heads of professional soldiers. Their weapons represent the military traditions of half a dozen different cultures. Ramesses III, in his great inscription, provides one of our few ancient attempts to explain this phenomenon. He speaks of a conspiracy made in their islands, of a great mustering in the seas around Cyprus. No land could stand before them, he claims. They had already destroyed Hatti, Kode, Carchemish, Azawa, and Alashia. They came with fire before them, their confederation advancing like a plague across the established world. The pharaoh's words carry a note of barely concealed panic beneath the traditional bombast. This was not normal warfare, as the Egyptians understood it. This was something new and terrible. The names themselves offer tantalizing clues to origins spread across the entire Mediterranean world. Modern scholars have spent 2 centuries attempting to decode them, to match them with known peoples and places. The Peleset perhaps became the Philistines of biblical fame. The Sherden might have hailed from Sardinia, where bronze figurines bearing horned helmets have been discovered. The Lukka were almost certainly the pirates of Lycia in southwestern Anatolia, mentioned in earlier diplomatic correspondence as a persistent threat to shipping. But for every tentative identification, a dozen questions arise. Were these independent peoples who formed an alliance of convenience, or refugees from collapsed civilizations forced together by shared catastrophe? Were they the cause of the Bronze Age collapse, or merely its most visible symptom? The Egyptian records speak of 2 great invasions, one during the reign of Meneptah, around 1207 BC, the other under Ramesses III, around 1177 BC. 30 years separated these attacks. enough time for an entire generation to be born and raised in the chaos that was consuming the Mediterranean world. The first invasion came primarily by land, allied with the Libyans attacking from the western desert. The second came by sea, a massive fleet that penetrated the very heart of Egypt through the Nile Delta. Both were repelled, but at tremendous cost. Egypt would never again project power beyond its borders, as it had during the height of the New Kingdom. The victory over the Sea Peoples was less a triumph than a last gasp. The greatest mystery remains their fate after the Egyptian defeats. They vanish from history as suddenly as they appeared, leaving only archaeological traces and linguistic echoes. The Philistine cities of the southern Levant show Aegean influence in their pottery and architecture. Genetic studies of ancient remains suggest European ancestry mixing with local populations. Place names and deity names across the Mediterranean preserve what might be memories of their passing. But the Sea Peoples themselves, as a coherent force capable of destroying empires, simply ceased to exist. Perhaps they achieved what they sought, not the conquest of Egypt, but new homes in a world they had helped empty. Perhaps they were absorbed into local populations, their distinct identities dissolving within a generation or two. Or perhaps, having served their purpose as agents of destruction, they simply had no role left to play in the new world that emerged from the ashes of the Bronze Age. Part 2. The Discoverers and Investigators. Champollion's Revelation. The year was 1822 AD, and in a modest room in Paris, a young French scholar sat hunched over sheets of papyrus reproductions, his fingers trembling with exhaustion and anticipation. Jean-François Champollion had devoted his entire adult life to this moment. Since childhood, he had mastered Coptic, Arabic, Hebrew, and Syriac, convinced that somewhere in these languages lay the key to unlocking the mysteries of ancient Egypt. The Rosetta Stone, that black basalt slab discovered during Napoleon's expedition, had provided the same text in 3 scripts: Greek, which scholars could read, Demotic, which they partially understood, and hieroglyphics, which had remained stubbornly mute for over 1,000 years. On September 14th, Champollion made the breakthrough that would change history. The cartouche containing the name of Ramesses was not merely symbolic but phonetic. The hieroglyphs could spell out sounds, form words, speak across the millennia. When he realized what he had discovered, Champollion rushed into his brother's room, cried out, "I have it!" and promptly fainted from the overwhelming emotion. Within months, he was reading texts that had been silent since Rome was young. Within years, the entire corpus of Egyptian literature began to reveal its secrets. Among the walls of stone and papyrus that Champollion and his successors would decipher, none would prove more mysterious than the massive reliefs at Medinet Habu. Here was history written by the victors, propaganda carved in stone, yet containing within it hints of a catastrophe so vast that even Egyptian royal bombast could not entirely obscure it. The temple complex, built by Ramesses III to commemorate his reign, devoted enormous space to a single naval battle. Wall after wall depicted warriors, unlike any in the standard Egyptian artistic repertoire. These were not Nubians or Libyans or Asiatics, the traditional enemies of Egypt, rendered in stereotypical forms, unchanged for centuries. These were something new. In 1855 AD, a French Egyptologist named Emmanuel de Rouget, studying these same reliefs, coined a term that would echo through archaeological literature for the next 2 centuries. Examining the hieroglyphic inscriptions that accompanied the battle scenes, he noted repeated references to peoples of the sea, foreign nations who had come from their islands to assault the very heart of Egypt. Pupils de la mer, he wrote in his notebook. Sea peoples. The name carried with it an inherent mystery, a suggestion of origins unknown and destinations uncertain. These were not landed nations with established territories, but wanderers of the waves, as ephemeral as sea foam and as destructive as tsunamis. But it was Gaston Maspero, de Rouget's student and eventual successor, who would transform the sea peoples from an Egyptian curiosity into a world historical phenomenon. Working in the 1870s and 80s AD, Maspero recognized that the inscriptions at Medinet Habu were describing not merely a local Egyptian crisis, but a Mediterranean-wide catastrophe. The pharaoh's boasts of victory were interlaced with admissions that entire empires had already fallen before these seaborne invaders reached Egypt. Hatti, the great Hittite Empire that had once contested with Egypt for control of the Levant, gone. Ugarit, the merchant city whose trade networks had enriched the entire eastern Mediterranean, burned. Cyprus, source of the copper that gave the Bronze Age its name, overrun. Maspero proposed something radical for his time, a theory of mass migration, entire peoples driven from their homelands by forces unknown, sweeping across the Mediterranean in a desperate search for new territories. He drew parallels to the Germanic migrations that had toppled Rome, to the Viking expansions of the medieval period. History, he argued, moved in great waves of population displacement, and the Sea Peoples represented one of the earliest and most dramatic examples. His theory would dominate scholarship for a century, though modern archaeology has complicated and challenged many of his assumptions. Petrie's desert findings. You stand in the western desert of Egypt in 1896 AD, the sun a merciless hammer overhead, the sand beneath your feet hot enough to burn through the soles of your boots. Around you, a team of Egyptian workers carefully sifts through ancient debris under the watchful eye of a small, intense Englishman whose methodical approach to excavation is revolutionizing archaeology. William Matthew Flinders Petrie does not seek gold or monuments. He seeks pottery sherds, burial goods, the everyday objects that others dismiss as worthless. In these humble artifacts, he believes, lies the true history of ancient peoples. Petrie's excavations would uncover something extraordinary, evidence of foreign peoples living in Egypt during the reign of Ramesses III and his successors. At sites throughout the Nile, Delta, and beyond, distinctive pottery appeared, unlike anything in the Egyptian tradition. The shapes were wrong, the decorative motifs alien, the clay itself of different composition. Here was material proof that the Sea Peoples were not merely literary invention or artistic convention, but real communities who had lived, worked, and died on Egyptian soil. In one remarkable discovery, Petrie uncovered the mummy of a palace official with distinctly fair hair, possibly of European extraction. The hieroglyphs identified him as Pentawere, a butler in service to the royal household. Could this man have been Teresh, one of the Sea Peoples mentioned in the inscriptions? Had he been captured in battle, enslaved, and eventually earned his freedom through loyal service? Or was he perhaps a second-generation immigrant, his parents among those mysterious invaders who had threatened the stability of the ancient world? The mummy could not answer these questions, but its very existence suggested that the story of the Sea Peoples did not end with their defeat on the battlefield. Petrie's most significant contribution was his recognition that cultural change could be traced through material remains. He developed a system of sequence, dating through pottery analysis, that allowed archaeologists to track the movement of peoples across time and space. When pottery styles suddenly changed, when new burial customs appeared, when different architectural techniques manifested, these indicated either invasion, migration, or intense cultural exchange. Using these methods, Petrie and his successors began to trace what appeared to be Aegean influences appearing throughout the eastern Mediterranean in the early 12th century BC, precisely when the Egyptian texts claimed the Sea Peoples had arrived. The evidence was fragmentary but suggestive. At Philistine sites in the southern Levant, pottery appeared that seemed to echo Mycenaean styles, but with local variations. Burial customs changed from the traditional Canaanite practices to something new, something that might have originated in the Aegean or Anatolia. Pig bones appeared in the archaeological record in quantities unusual for the region, suggesting dietary preferences brought from elsewhere. Architectural innovations, particularly the hearth rooms found in Philistine houses, bore striking similarities to structures found in Cyprus and the Aegean islands. Yet, for every answer Petrie's methods provided, new questions arose. If the Philistines were indeed the Peleset of Egyptian records, where exactly had they originated? The pottery showed Aegean influences, but was not identical to any known Mycenaean styles. The architecture suggested Cyprus, but the burial customs pointed toward Anatolia, where the Sea Peoples, a confederation of different groups, refugees and raiders, mixed together by the chaos of the collapsing Bronze Age. Or were they a single people whose material culture had been transformed by their long journey across the Mediterranean? Is less than #0. 5 is greater than. Most puzzling of all was the question of timing. The destruction layers that marked the end of the Bronze Age cities did not all date to the same year, or even the same decade. Some cities burned in 1200 BC, others in 1180 BC, still others in 1150 BC. The collapse was not a single catastrophic event, but a rolling disaster that took generations to fully unfold. The Sea Peoples appeared in Egyptian records in 1207 BC and 1177 BC, but signs of destruction and displacement began earlier and continued later. Were they the cause of the collapse, riding the wave of destruction, or merely one of its many symptoms? Petrie lived to see his careful scientific methods validated by discoveries across the Mediterranean. The Uluburun shipwreck revealed the incredible wealth and complexity of late Bronze Age trade. Excavations at Mycenaean palaces showed clear signs of violent destruction. The discovery and translation of Linear B tablets proved that the Mycenaean Greeks were literate, organized, and engaged in the same kind of palace economy that characterized the rest of the Bronze Age world. Each new discovery added details to the picture, but the full image remained frustratingly elusive. The Sea Peoples had passed through history like a violent storm, leaving destruction in their wake, but little evidence of who they truly were or where they had gone. Part 3. The Discovery Process. Ugarit's Final Hours. The year was 1929 AD, and a Syrian farmer's plough struck something hard beneath the soil of Ras Shamra, a coastal tell that had slept undisturbed for 3 millennia. What emerged from that accidental discovery would provide archaeology with one of its most poignant windows into the death of the Bronze Age world. For this was ancient Ugarit, and unlike Egypt's triumphant inscriptions or Greece's heroic myths, Ugarit would tell the story of the collapse from the perspective of the victims, preserved in the very moment of their destruction. The French archaeologist Claude Schaeffer, who would dedicate his life to excavating this site, uncovered a city that had been wealthy beyond imagination. Ugarit sat at the crossroads of the ancient world, where goods from Mesopotamia met those from Egypt, where Aegean merchants haggled with Hittite traders. The city's archives, written in no fewer than 8 different scripts and languages, revealed a cosmopolitan centre where a dozen cultures mingled freely. Here was found the world's first alphabet, ancestor to the letters you read now, invented by some nameless scribe who grew tired of memorizing thousands of cuneiform symbols. But it was in the city's final destruction layer that Schaeffer made his most haunting discovery. Clay tablets, some still warm from the kiln when the city burned, lay scattered through the ruins. These were not the careful diplomatic correspondence of prosperous times, but desperate messages hastily inscribed and never sent. One tablet, addressed to the King of Cyprus, pleads for immediate assistance. "My father, behold, the enemy ships came here. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. Does not my father know that all my troops and chariots are in the land of Hatti, and all my ships are in the land of Lukka? Thus, the country is abandoned to itself. May my father know it. The 7 ships of the enemy that came here inflicted much damage upon us." 7 ships, just 7 ships, had been enough to overwhelm a city that had stood for thousands of years. The implications staggered archaeologists. If 7 vessels could destroy Ugarit, how many would it take to topple an empire? The tablets revealed more. The city's army was away, fighting in foreign wars. Its navy was deployed elsewhere, perhaps trying to stem the tide of invasion at some other crucial point. When the end came, Ugarit stood defenseless, its wealth a beacon for raiders, its walls meaningless against enemies who came from the sea. You can almost smell the acrid smoke that must have filled the streets that final day. Hear the crackle of flames consuming cedar beams, imported at great expense from Lebanon. Feel the heat that baked those final tablets into permanence. The palace scribes, trained from childhood in the delicate art of cuneiform, spending their last hours not in prayer or flight but in documentation, as if by recording the disaster they could somehow make sense of it. One tablet speaks of enemy ships sighted off the coast. Another mentions that the watchtowers had been abandoned. A third, perhaps the last ever written in Ugarit, simply states, "When your messenger arrived, the army was humiliated and the city was sacked. Our food in the threshing floors was burned, and the vineyards were also destroyed. Our city is sacked. May you know it, may you know it." The repetition of that final phrase carries across 3,000 years with desperate urgency. May you know it. As if knowledge itself could serve as a weapon against chaos. As if by informing others of their fate, the people of Ugarit could prevent the same from happening elsewhere. But elsewhere was already burning. The Hittite Empire, which the king of Ugarit references as the location of his army, was itself collapsing. The ordered world that had existed for centuries was coming apart, and no amount of correspondence could halt its dissolution. The painted warriors of Medinet Habu. Stand before the great temple walls of Medinet Habu and let your eyes adjust to the Egyptian sun blazing off limestone surfaces. Here, carved in relief, and once painted in brilliant colours that have long since faded to hints and shadows, unfolds one of the most detailed battle narratives ever created in the ancient world. Ramesses III did not merely record his victory over the sea peoples, he created a visual encyclopedia of his enemies, a stone catalogue of the forces that had brought the Bronze Age to its knees. The first thing that strikes any observer is the sheer diversity of the invaders. Egyptian art followed strict conventions that had remained unchanged for millennia. Enemies were depicted in standardized ways. Nubians with their distinctive hairstyles and dark skin, Libyans with their feathers and tattoos, Asiatics with their pointed beards and colorful robes. But the sea peoples broke these conventions. The artists, clearly working from life, or from very recent memory, struggled to capture something unprecedented. Here were warriors who fit no existing category, who required new artistic vocabulary to properly represent. The Peleset warriors stand out immediately with their distinctive feathered headdresses that sweep back from their foreheads like the crests of exotic birds. The feathers, probably crane or heron, would have rustled with each movement, creating an intimidating display that was both practical and psychological. Their faces are clean, shaven, unusual in an age when beards signified masculinity and status. They carry small round shields and straight swords, neither of which match standard Egyptian military equipment. Their kilts, short and seemingly made of strips of leather or fabric, allow for greater mobility than the longer garments worn by Egyptian soldiers. The Sherden present an entirely different appearance. Their horned helmets, perhaps made of bronze or leather, with actual horns attached, give them an almost demonic appearance in the Egyptian artistic style. Some scholars see in these helmets a connection to Sardinia, where similar bronze figurines have been found. Others point to Anatolia, where horned symbolism carried religious significance. The Sherden carry longer swords and different shields from the Peleset, suggesting not merely different equipment, but different military traditions entirely. Some are shown serving alongside Egyptian forces, a reminder that mercenary service often preceded and followed raiding. Most revealing of all are the scenes that show not just warriors but entire communities in motion. Ox carts, lumber forward carrying women and children, their possessions piled high. The carts themselves are technological marvels for their time, with spoke wheels, rather than the solid wheels used in earlier periods, allowing them to traverse longer distances with heavier loads. The women wear long dresses and distinctive headdresses different from Egyptian styles. Children peer out from beneath canvas coverings. Elderly figures clutch walking sticks. These are not raiders who would return home after a season of plundering. These are entire populations seeking new lands to settle. The naval battle scenes provide our only contemporary depictions of sea people's vessels. Their ships differ markedly from Egyptian designs, with high prows and sterns decorated with bird heads, probably representing seabirds or mythological creatures. The vessels appear to be powered by both sail and oar, giving them advantages in both speed and maneuverability. Egyptian artists show grappling hooks being thrown, hand-to-hand combat on tilting decks, and bodies falling into the Nile where crocodiles wait. The violence is explicit and unromanticized. This was not glorious warfare, but desperate survival. The attention to detail extends even to the smallest elements. Different hairstyles are meticulously rendered. Some warriors wear their hair long, others have it bound up in top knots. Still others appear to have shaved heads, with single locks remaining. Weapons show variety not just between different groups but within them. Spears of varying lengths, swords both straight and curved, daggers tucked into belts, bows both simple and composite. Each variation possibly represents a different tradition, a different homeland, a different story of how its bearer came to be standing on an Egyptian battlefield. Cyprus, the gathering storm. The island of Cyprus floats in the eastern Mediterranean, like a stepping stone between worlds, visible from both the Anatolian coast and the Levant on clear days. In the late Bronze Age, this island was called Al-Ashia, and its copper mines made it one of the wealthiest territories in the known world. The very name Cyprus derives from the Latin word for copper, cuprum, itself derived from the phrase as cyprium, meaning metal of Cyprus. Control of this island meant control of bronze production, and control of bronze production meant military and economic supremacy. Modern excavations at sites like Nkomi, Kishon, and Mar Paleocastro have revealed that something extraordinary happened on Cyprus around 1200 BC. The archaeological evidence does not speak of simple destruction, as seen elsewhere, but of transformation. New peoples arrived, bringing with them different pottery styles, different architectural traditions, different burial customs, but rather than destroying what they found, they seem to have merged with it, creating a hybrid culture that combined elements of the Aegean, Anatolia, and the Levant. At Nkomi, archaeologists uncovered what may be the smoking gun of sea people's presence: bronze stands decorated with scenes that mirror those at Medinet Habu. Warriors with feathered headdresses process in ritual fashion. Ships with bird head prows sail stylized seas. Most intriguing of all, an ivory game box depicts a chariot scene on one side and figures that could be sea peoples on the other, as if representing the old world and the new in direct opposition. The craftsmanship is exquisite, suggesting not crude invaders but sophisticated peoples with their own artistic traditions. You run your fingers across a piece of pottery found in the destruction layer, feeling the raised decorations that mark it as Mycenaean in inspiration, but not in execution. This is local clay, fired in local kilns, but decorated with motifs that originated hundreds of miles away across the sea. Someone who knew the Aegean tradition made this, but made it here, on Cyprus, probably after the palaces of mainland Greece had already fallen. Were they refugees from those destroyed palaces? Merchants who found themselves stranded when the trade networks collapsed? Warriors who decided that Cyprus, with its copper wealth and strategic position, offered better prospects than wherever they had originated? The fortifications tell their own story. Massive walls were constructed at several sites, using a technique called Cyclopean masonry, named for the mythical Cyclopes, because later Greeks could not believe humans had moved such enormous stones. But these were not walls built against a single threat. They were rebuilt, expanded, modified over decades. The threat was not a one-time invasion, but a continuous state of insecurity. Whoever held Cyprus during this period lived in constant fear of attack, whether from sea raiders, displaced peoples, or the remnants of collapsing empires trying to secure resources for survival. At the site of Mar Paleocastro, on the western coast of Cyprus, archaeologists found evidence of a planned settlement built around 1190 BC, apparently by peoples with strong Aegean connections. The town was laid out in an organized grid, with standardized house plans and a clear defensive strategy. But it lasted only 2 generations before being abandoned. No destruction layer, no signs of violence, just abandonment, as if its inhabitants had decided, after 50 years of trying to maintain their foothold, that Cyprus was not to be their final destination after all. The copper workshops reveal the most telling evidence. Production never ceased. Throughout the entire period of chaos, when cities burned across the Mediterranean, when empires fell and trade routes dissolved, the furnaces of Cyprus kept burning. Someone was mining the ore. Someone was smelting it. Someone was trading it. The techniques changed, becoming more efficient, suggesting new knowledge brought by newcomers. The distribution patterns changed, with less copper going to the traditional palace centres and more to new emerging powers. Cyprus had survived by becoming indispensable, by continuing to produce the one resource everyone needed, regardless of who claimed to rule it. Part 4. Revelation of Findings. The Sherden, pirates turned protectors. In the year 1274 BC, the dust of Kadesh still swirling in the Syrian air, 2 great armies faced each other across a battlefield that would echo through history. But look closer at the forces of Ramesses II, and you will see something remarkable. Among his elite troops, serving as his personal bodyguard, stand warriors whose horned helmets mark them as anything but Egyptian. These are the Sherden, the same sea raiders who had attacked Egypt just years before, now defending the very pharaoh their brothers had tried to destroy. This transformation from pirate to protector represents one of the most intriguing aspects of the Sea Peoples phenomenon, a reminder that identity in the ancient world was fluid, loyalty negotiable, and yesterday's enemy could become tomorrow's most trusted soldier. The Sherden appear in Egyptian records earlier than any other Sea Peoples, mentioned in the Amarna letters from the 14th century BC as mercenaries serving in Egyptian garrisons. By the time of Ramesses II, they had become so integral to Egyptian military structure that they were granted land near the sacred temple complexes of Karnak, an honour reserved for the most valued servants of the crown. The Papyrus Wilbur, an administrative document from the late New Kingdom, records Sherden families settled throughout the Nile Delta, their foreign names slowly becoming Egyptianized, their children growing up as Egyptian as any native born along the river. But where had they originated? The bronze figurines of Sardinia offer our most tantalizing clues. On that island in the center of the Mediterranean, a mysterious civilization built massive stone towers called nuraghi, structures so impressive that later Greek visitors compared them to the legendary labyrinths of Crete. The bronze figurines produced by this culture, dating from the 13th century BC onwards, depict warriors with horned helmets, virtually identical to those shown on the Sherden at Medinet Habu. They carry round shields studded with bronze bosses. Their swords are long and straight, designed for slashing rather than the stabbing motions favoured by Egyptian weapons. Some figurines show them in boats with high prows, vessels built for speed and manoeuvrability rather than cargo capacity. The archaeological evidence from Sardinia reveals a culture experiencing dramatic change during the Late Bronze Age. Nuraghi construction accelerated, growing from simple towers to complex fortified settlements. Metal production increased exponentially, with copper and lead mines working at unprecedented capacity. Trade goods from across the Mediterranean appear in Sardinian sites: Mycenaean pottery, Cypriot copper ingots, amber from the Baltic. This was not an isolated island, but a central node in maritime trade networks, perfectly positioned to launch raids in any direction when those networks began to collapse. Consider the journey a young Sardinian warrior might have taken in the 13th century BC. Raised in the shadow of a nuraghi, trained from childhood in the use of sword and spear, he would have heard stories of the wealthy cities to the east, where kings lived in palaces larger than entire villages, where gold flowed like water, and even common soldiers ate meat daily. When the harvest failed, when the rains did not come, when the population grew beyond what the island could support, the sea offered opportunity. A few ships, a few dozen fighters, and fortune could be seized from those soft city dwellers who had grown too dependent on their chariots and their walls. But the Sherden were not simple raiders. The fact that they served as mercenaries for generations before the collapse, that they were trusted with the pharaoh's own safety, that they were settled in Egypt as valued military colonists, suggests a more complex relationship with the established powers. They were intermediaries between worlds, comfortable in both the ordered palace societies and the anarchic freedom of the sea. When the Bronze Age system finally collapsed, the Sherden were perfectly positioned to survive, already established in Egypt, already adapted to serving new masters while maintaining their distinct identity. The Lukka, lords of the Lycian shore. The southwestern coast of Anatolia rises from the sea in a series of dramatic cliffs and hidden coves, a landscape seemingly designed by the gods for piracy. This is Lycia, the land of the Lukka, and for centuries before the Bronze Age collapse, its inhabitants had terrorized the shipping lanes of the eastern Mediterranean. Unlike the other sea peoples who appear suddenly in the historical record, the Lukka had a long, documented history of maritime raiding, diplomatic manipulation, and strategic survival on the margins of great empires. You stand on a Lycian headland in the 13th century BC, salt spray stinging your face, watching the merchant vessels far below navigate the treacherous waters between Rhodes and the mainland. Your grandfather raided these same waters, as did his grandfather before him. The Lukka have no kings in the traditional sense, no palace bureaucracies, no armies of scribes recording taxes and tributes. Instead, they have chiefs who command loyalty through success in war, who distribute plunder according to ancient customs, who know every hidden anchorage and seasonal wind pattern along 1,000 miles of coastline. The Hittite archives speak of the Lukka with a mixture of frustration and grudging respect. They were nominally vassals of the Hittite Empire, but their submission was purely theoretical. When Hittite power was strong, the Lukka would send token tribute and refrain from raiding Hittite allies. When the empire weakened, Lukka pirates would strike at will, disappearing into their mountainous homeland where no chariot could follow. The Hittite king, Tudela IV, complained that he had to station troops permanently on the Lycaon border, resources he desperately needed elsewhere just to keep the Lukka contained. The archaeological evidence from Lycia during this period is sparse but telling. No great palaces have been found, no administrative archives, no monumental architecture from the Bronze Age. Instead, there are fortified hilltop settlements, positioned to watch the sea approaches and signal to each other when targets or threats appeared. The material culture shows connections to both the Aegean and Anatolia, but remains distinctly local. These were people who took what they wanted from neighbouring civilizations, but remained stubbornly independent, refusing to be absorbed into any empire's administrative structure. The Lukka appear at every major crisis point in the late Bronze Age. When Atasia, an early Mycenaean warlord, attacked Cyprus in the 15th century BC, the Lukka sailed with him. When the anti-Hittite coalition formed in western Anatolia, the Lukka joined it. When Egypt was invaded by sea peoples in 1207 BC and 1177 BC, the Lukka were there again. They were opportunists of the highest order, sensing weakness like sharks detecting blood in the water, always ready to exploit any disruption to the established order. Most revealing is the letter from the king of Ugarit, desperately reporting that his navy was away stationed in Lukka waters when his city came under attack. Why would Ugarit's fleet be so far from home during such dangerous times? The only reasonable explanation is that they were trying to prevent Lukka pirates from joining the general assault on the eastern Mediterranean. They failed, Ugarit burned, and the Lukka continued their raiding for centuries afterward, eventually becoming the Lycians of classical antiquity, still maintaining their reputation as fierce warriors and unreliable allies. The Peleset, settlers of Philistia. The 5 cities of the Philistine Pentapolis rose from the coastal plains of southern Canaan like transplanted fragments of another world. Ashkelon, Ashdod, Gaza, Ekron, and Gath, each a fortress city-state, controlling rich agricultural lands and strategic trade routes. The archaeological evidence from these sites tells a story of cultural transformation so dramatic that it can only be explained by the arrival of new peoples bringing radically different traditions. These were the Peleset of Egyptian records, and their settlement in Canaan represents the most successful and enduring legacy of the Sea People's invasions. Walk through the excavated remains of ancient Ashkelon, and you encounter a material culture that seems to have been transported directly from the Aegean world. The pottery, though made from local clay, follows Mycenaean forms and decorative patterns. The cooking vessels are designed for different cuisines, with special jugs for beer and wine, hearth rooms for roasting meats, rather than the bread ovens traditional to Canaan. Pig bones appear in quantities unprecedented in this region where pork consumption had been minimal for millennia. The architecture features megaron-style buildings with central hearths, a design originating in Bronze Age Greece and Anatolia. But this was not simple cultural transplantation. Within a generation or two, the pure Aegean styles began to blend with local Canaanite traditions, creating a distinctive Philistine material culture that was neither Greek nor Semitic, but something entirely new. The pottery developed unique bichrome decorations, combining Aegean motifs with local symbolic elements. The temples incorporated both Aegean and Canaanite religious practices. The Philistines adopted the Semitic language of their neighbours, while maintaining distinct cultural practices that marked them as different for centuries. The Hebrew Bible, one of our few literary sources for this period, depicts the Philistines as formidable enemies who dominated the southern Levant for generations. The story of Samson shows them as sophisticated urban dwellers who control advanced military technology, particularly the secret of ironworking that gave them superior weapons. The tale of David and Goliath presents them as producing warriors of extraordinary size and skill, protected by bronze armor and wielding weapons the Israelites could barely comprehend. These were not primitive raiders, but organized city-states with professional armies, skilled craftsmen, and complex political structures. Genetic studies of burials from Philistine sites have provided stunning confirmation of their foreign origins. DNA analysis reveals a significant influx of European ancestry, appearing suddenly in the early 12th century BC, mixed with the local Levantine population. Within 200 years, this foreign genetic signature had become diluted through intermarriage, but its initial appearance is dramatic and undeniable. These were indeed newcomers from across the sea, arriving in sufficient numbers to transform the genetic landscape of the region. The Egyptian records provide crucial context for understanding how the Peleset became the Philistines. The Papyrus Harris states that Ramesses III settled defeated sea peoples in fortresses bound in his name, essentially establishing them as military colonists guarding Egypt's northeastern frontier. This would explain the seemingly peaceful establishment of Philistine cities in areas that had been under Egyptian control. Rather than conquerors, the Peleset may have arrived as Egyptian proxies, settled by pharaonic authority, to create a buffer zone against other potential invaders. The Mycenaean connection. Picture the Great Palace at Pylos, burning on a summer night around 1200 BC. The Linear B tablets, normally sun-dried and reusable, are being baked into permanence by the very flames that are destroying the civilization that created them. In these final records, hastily inscribed by doomed scribes, we read of watchers being sent to the coast, of bronze being collected from the temples to forge weapons, of offerings being made to gods who would not answer. The Mycenaean world, that glorious warrior culture that had dominated the Aegean for centuries, was dying, and from its ashes would emerge peoples who might well have become some of the Sea Peoples. The evidence linking Mycenaean Greece to the Sea Peoples is compelling but frustratingly incomplete. The Ekwesh mentioned in Egyptian sources bear a name strikingly similar to the Achaeans of Homer, one of the three names he uses for the Greeks who besieged Troy. The material culture of the Philistines shows undeniable Aegean influences. The weapons and armor depicted at Medinet Habu match archaeological finds from Mycenaean sites. The timing is perfect, the palace is full, and within a generation, Aegean-style warriors appear across the eastern Mediterranean. The Mycenaean palaces were centers of a complex redistributive economy, controlling specialized craft production, long-distance trade, and military power. When they burned, whether through internal conflict, external invasion, or systems collapse, thousands of people who had depended on the palaces for their livelihoods would have been cast adrift. Palace guards trained in warfare, craftsmen skilled in metallurgy, sailors who knew the sea routes, scribes who understood multiple languages, all suddenly without patrons or purpose. The sea offered the only escape from a homeland that could no longer support them. Consider the trajectory of a Mycenaean warrior whose palace has just burned. He owns his bronze armor, inherited from his father, worth more than most families earn in a lifetime. He knows how to fight, both from chariots and on foot. He speaks enough different languages to communicate in any port from Sicily to Cyprus. He has cousins who serve as mercenaries in Egypt, brothers who trade in Anatolia, uncles who raided the Levantine coast in their youth. When the palace that gave structure to his world disappears, when the agricultural system that fed his family collapses, when drought makes farming impossible anyway, what choice does he have but to gather with others like him and seek their fortunes elsewhere? The archaeological evidence shows Mycenaean-style pottery and weapons appearing along the exact routes the Sea Peoples are said to have taken. Cyprus shows massive influx of Aegean material culture. The southern Levant produces locally made Mycenaean-style pottery in quantities that suggest not just trade, but population movement. Even distant Sardinia yields pottery and bronze work with Aegean connections. This is not the pattern of normal trade, but of diaspora, of peoples carrying their material culture with them as they search for new homes. Yet problems remain with simply equating Mycenaeans with Sea Peoples. The Egyptian sources describe the Ekwesh as circumcised, a practice not associated with Bronze Age Greeks. The diversity of Sea Peoples depicted at Medinet Habu suggests multiple origins, not a single Greek exodus. The destruction of Mycenaean palaces occurred over several decades, not all at once, making a coordinated invasion unlikely. Perhaps most importantly, no Mycenaean records mention organizing such expeditions, though admittedly, literacy disappeared with the palaces, so no such records could have been created. The truth may be that Mycenaean refugees were one element in a much larger phenomenon. As their world collapsed, they joined with Anatolian warriors, displaced by Hittite collapse, Italic peoples pushed out by Urnfield expansion, islanders whose trade networks had disintegrated, and indigenous pirates who had always operated on the margins. Together, they formed the confederations that would challenge Egypt and transform the Mediterranean world. The Mycenaean contribution may have been their military expertise, their knowledge of palace weak points, their understanding of Bronze Age political structures. They knew how the old world worked, which made them perfectly suited to help destroy it. Part 5. Interpretations and Debates. Systems collapse. When dominoes fall. The Bronze Age world did not die in a day, or a year, or even a decade. It expired slowly, like a great beast bleeding from 1,000 wounds, each injury making the next more likely, each collapse triggering another until the entire interconnected system that had sustained civilization for centuries simply ceased to function. Modern scholars, looking back across 3 millennia, have coined a term for this phenomenon: systems collapse. It is a clinical phrase that barely hints at the human tragedy it describes. The millions who starved when trade routes failed, who died defending cities that no longer had purpose, who wandered homeless across landscapes they no longer recognized. To understand systems collapse, you must first grasp how interdependent the Bronze Age world had become. No palace stood alone. The pharaoh in Thebes required tin from Afghanistan to make the bronze weapons that maintained his power. That tin travelled through Babylon, which needed textiles from Anatolia to trade for it. The Hittites, who controlled Anatolia, required grain from Egypt when their own harvests failed. Egypt needed cedar from Lebanon for its temples and ships, copper from Cyprus for its tools, and mercenaries from the Aegean for its armies. Remove any single element from this equation, and the entire structure begins to wobble. Remove several simultaneously, and collapse becomes inevitable. The evidence for environmental crisis is written in the very earth itself. Core samples from the Mediterranean seabed reveal a dramatic shift in pollen types around 1200 BC, indicating a sudden transition from wet-loving plants to those adapted to arid conditions. This was not a gradual climate change that societies could adapt to over generations, but a sharp shock that would have caused immediate agricultural failure. In the Levant, where farming had always walked the knife edge between sufficiency and starvation, even a 20% reduction in rainfall would have meant catastrophe. The Dead Sea, that great natural archive of climate history, tells its own story. Its water levels dropped precipitously during the 13th and 12th centuries BC, reaching their lowest point in millennia. Salt deposits from this period show rapid crystallization patterns, indicating extreme evaporation rates. The Jordan River system that fed it had slowed to a trickle. If the relatively water-rich Jordan Valley was suffering, what was happening in the marginal lands where most people actually lived? Famine breeds desperation, and desperation breeds violence. The Hittite prayers from this period plead with their gods to end the hunger that was destroying their kingdom from within. Egyptian records speak of grain shipments to Hatti, their traditional enemy, because even Pharaoh understood that starving neighbours meant raiders and refugees at his borders. A letter from the last king of Ugarit mentions that a single ship carrying grain was more valuable than a fleet of warships. Food had become the ultimate currency, more precious than gold, more powerful than bronze. But the climate crisis was only one factor in the system's collapse. The very complexity that had made the Bronze Age palaces so successful also made them vulnerable. These were centralized economies, where the palace controlled production, distribution, and trade. Scribes recorded every transaction, soldiers enforced every collection, craftsmen worked only under palace supervision. When the palace burned, whether from earthquake, invasion, or internal revolt, the entire economic system it managed ceased to exist. There was no backup, no alternative structure that could step in to organize society. The knowledge of how to manage such complex systems often died with the scribes who maintained them. Consider the tin trade, that vital artery that kept the Bronze Age alive. Tin from Afghanistan had to pass through multiple intermediaries, each taking their profit, each providing security for their section of the route. When Babylon fell to the Elamites in 1158 BC, cutting off eastern trade, the workshops of the Mediterranean suddenly found themselves without the raw material essential to their existence. No tin meant no new bronze. No new bronze meant no new weapons. No new weapons meant no way to defend against raiders, whether they were sea peoples or simply desperate neighbours looking to survive another day. The archaeological record reveals attempts to adapt to this crisis. Bronze objects were melted down and recast repeatedly, each recycling making the metal more brittle. Weapons were repaired rather than replaced, with visible mending marks on swords and spearheads. Some sites show evidence of experimenting with iron as a substitute, though the technology to work it effectively was still rare. The very desperation of these measures speaks to how suddenly and completely the old supply chains had failed. Warriors or refugees? The reliefs at Medinet Habu hold a detail that fundamentally challenges our understanding of the sea peoples. Behind the warriors with their distinctive helmets and shields come ox carts, creaking under the weight of all the possessions a family could carry. Women clutch infants to their breasts. Children peer out from beneath cloth coverings. Old people steady themselves against the cart sides as wheels bump over rough ground. These are not the camp followers that typically accompanied ancient armies, prostitutes, and merchants looking to profit from war. These are families, complete communities in motion, carrying with them everything they owned in the world. You are a potter's wife from a Mycenaean village in 1200 BC. Your husband learned his craft from his father, who learned from his father before him the techniques passed down since before memory. The palace at Pylos, 2 days' walk away, bought every piece he made, distributing them through the palace network in exchange for rations of grain, oil, and wine. Then the palace burned. The soldiers who had protected the region disappeared. The scribes who organized distribution vanished. Raiders came from the sea, from the mountains, from neighboring villages that were just as desperate as your own. Your husband makes the only decision he can, to load the kiln tools, the remaining clay, what little food remains, onto a cart and join the growing stream of refugees heading toward the coast where ships are gathering. The distinction between warrior and refugee, raider and migrant may be entirely artificial when applied to the sea peoples. In the chaos of societal collapse, these categories would have been fluid, changing based on circumstances and opportunities. The same group might be peaceful traders when approaching a strong city, desperate refugees when seeking aid, and ruthless raiders when encountering weakness. The weapons they carried were as much for protection during their journey as for aggression against others. In a world where central authority had vanished, where law existed only at sword point, the difference between offensive and defensive violence became meaningless. Modern parallels help us understand this dynamic. The Germanic tribes that contributed to Rome's fall were simultaneously invaders and refugees, pushed from their homelands by Hun expansion, pulled toward Roman territories by the promise of land and stability. The Vikings of the early medieval period were traders, raiders, and settlers, sometimes all three in the same voyage. The sea peoples likely operated under similar multiple identities, their behavior determined by what each situation demanded for survival, is less than #0. 5 is greater than next, and the Egyptian sources themselves hint at this complexity. Some Sherden fought against Egypt, while others served in Pharaoh's army. The Peleset who attacked Egypt were later settled by Egyptian authority in Canaan, transformed from enemies to buffer states in a single generation. The Lukka appear as both pirates and mercenaries, their loyalty determined by who could pay or protect them. These were not monolithic ethnic groups with unified purposes, but loose confederations of the displaced, held together by shared desperation and temporary common cause. Archaeological evidence supports this refugee hypothesis. The material culture that appears in the Levant after the Bronze Age collapse is not uniform but remarkably diverse, as if multiple groups with different traditions had suddenly been thrown together. Pottery styles from the Aegean, Cyprus, and Anatolia appear side by side. Burial customs vary dramatically, even within single sites. Religious practices combine elements from multiple traditions. This is the archaeological signature of refugee communities, where survival takes precedence over maintaining pure cultural traditions. The weapons technology tells another story. The Naue Type II swords that appear across the Mediterranean in this period were not the specialized weapons of professional soldiers, but versatile tools that could be used by anyone with basic training. They were effective against both armored and unarmored opponents, useful for both mounted and foot combat, simple enough to be manufactured by any competent smith. These were the weapons of citizen soldiers, of farmers forced to become fighters, of craftsmen defending their families. The democratization of warfare that these swords represent may have been both cause and consequence of the Bronze Age collapse. Part 6. Theories of decline. The climate catastrophe. The Earth itself bears witness to what happened 3,000 years ago. In laboratory after laboratory across the modern world, scientists peer at ancient mud cores, pulled from lake beds and ocean floors, reading in their layered sediments a story of catastrophe that no human hand recorded. Each core is a timeline written in pollen and plankton, in volcanic ash and Saharan dust, in the microscopic shells of organisms that lived and died as the Bronze Age world collapsed around them. What they reveal is a climate event so severe that it may have been the primary trigger for everything that followed, the first domino that set all others falling. In the hills above the Sea of Galilee, the Birkat Ram crater lake has been accumulating sediment since before humans learned to write. Scientists, drilling into its depths, have extracted cores that span millennia, each centimetre representing years of accumulated organic matter. Around 1200 BC, the pollen dramatically shifts. Oak pollen, which requires substantial rainfall, virtually disappears. In its place comes the pollen of drought-resistant shrubs and grasses. The change is not gradual but sharp, occurring within a span of decades. This was not normal climate variation, but a sudden, severe aridification that would have transformed the landscape within a single human lifetime. You are a farmer in the Hittite highlands in 1250 BC, watching the spring rains fail for the third consecutive year. Your grandfather spoke of seasons when the rain came like clockwork, when the wheat grew tall and the barley fields stretched golden to the horizon. Now the earth is hard as bronze beneath your plough. The seeds you plant shrivel in the ground. The streams that once ran year-round are dry gullies filled with dust. Your children's bellies distend with hunger, while you calculate how many days of grain remain in the storage jars. When the tax collectors arrive from the capital, demanding their portion of a harvest that never came, you face an impossible choice. Surrender what little remains and watch your family starve, or resist and face the bronze weapons of the palace guard. The evidence for this great drought extends across the entire eastern Mediterranean. Isotope analysis of carbon and nitrogen in human bones from this period reveals dramatic dietary stress. The ratios indicate that people were eating progressively less protein, relying increasingly on whatever plants could survive the arid conditions. In some cases, the isotope signatures suggest consumption of foods that would normally be considered famine fare: grass seeds, tree bark, perhaps even leather. These were people dying slowly of malnutrition, even before the cities burned and the armies marched. Cave formations tell their own tale of climate catastrophe. Stalactites and stalagmites grow through the slow accumulation of minerals from dripping water, their growth rings recording rainfall patterns like tree rings. In caves from Greece to Israel, the formations show dramatically slowed growth around 1200 BC, in some cases stopping entirely for decades. The Sorek cave in Israel, whose formations provide one of the most detailed climate records in the region, shows the period from 1225 to 1175 BC as the driest in the previous 4,000 years. This was not a local phenomenon, but a regional catastrophe, affecting millions of people across thousands of miles. The mechanism behind this climate shift remains debated, but several factors likely converged. Volcanic eruptions, evidenced by ash layers in ice cores from Greenland, would have thrown particulates into the atmosphere, disrupting weather patterns. Changes in solar radiation, traced through carbon-14 variations, suggest the sun itself may have been cycling through a period of reduced output. Ocean current shifts, particularly in the Atlantic, could have redirected the storms that brought winter rains to the Mediterranean. Whatever the precise cause, the effect was devastating. 300 years of drought that would not fully abate until the dawn of the classical period. Earthquakes and fire stand in the ruins of Mycenae, and you can still see where the great walls cracked and shifted, massive stones, weighing tons displaced by forces that dwarf human strength. The marks of earthquake damage are written across the Bronze Age Aegean like a signature of divine wrath. But these were not isolated tremors. Between 1225 and 1175 BC, a storm of earthquakes struck the eastern Mediterranean with a frequency and intensity that modern seismology is only now beginning to understand. This was not simply bad luck, but the result of tectonic forces that had been building for centuries, releasing their energy at the worst possible moment for human civilization. The eastern Mediterranean sits at the intersection of three major tectonic plates: the African, Arabian, and Eurasian. Along their boundaries run fault lines that regularly produce devastating earthquakes. But certain periods see increased activity. Earthquake storms, where one major tremor triggers another, propagating destruction along interconnected fault systems. The evidence from the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC suggests exactly such a storm, with major earthquakes striking in rapid succession across the entire region. At Troy, archaeologists have identified clear earthquake damage in the layer known as Troy 6, the city that existed just before the destruction associated with the Trojan War. Walls collapsed inward in a pattern consistent with lateral ground movement. Human skeletons were found crushed beneath fallen masonry, their positions suggesting they had no warning before the walls came down. The subsequent city, Troy 7A, was rebuilt with noticeably different construction techniques, including more flexible foundations that could better withstand seismic activity. Someone had learned from catastrophe, though the lesson came too late to save the Bronze Age city. The palace at Tiryns in Greece shows even more dramatic evidence. Entire sections of the Cyclopean walls, constructed from stones so large that later Greeks believed only giants could have moved them, were knocked out of alignment. The Lion Gate at Mycenae, that iconic entrance to Agamemnon's citadel, shows clear signs of earthquake damage and hasty repair. At Pylos, the palace burned so intensely that clay tablets were fired into permanence. But beneath the burn layer, archaeologists found evidence of structural collapse consistent with seismic activity. The earthquake may have come first, trapping people and materials that then burned when cooking fires or oil lamps were overturned. You feel the ground shift beneath your feet, a sensation like standing on water. The birds fall silent, dogs howl, then comes the roar, not from above but from below, as if the earth itself were screaming. The palace walls, those massive stones that have stood since before your grandfather's grandfather was born, begin to dance. Dust cascades from the ceiling. Pottery crashes from shelves. The great wooden beams that support the roof groan and crack. You run for the doorway, but the floor tilts, throwing you against a wall that should not be moving. When the shaking finally stops, half the palace has collapsed, and fires have already started in 3 different places from overturned braziers. There is no organised firefighting force, no way to coordinate rescue efforts. The scribes who might have organised recovery are dead beneath tons of stone. The palace, that centre of all economic and political life, has become a tomb. But earthquakes alone cannot explain the total collapse. Many cities destroyed in this period show no evidence of seismic damage, only burning. The pattern suggests that earthquakes may have been the catalyst that weakened centralised authority, destroyed food stores, and disrupted trade routes, making cities vulnerable to other threats. A palace damaged by earthquake might take years to rebuild, during which time its military forces would be dispersed, its economy disrupted, its population vulnerable to raiders or internal revolt. The earthquakes did not destroy Bronze Age civilization directly, but they may have wounded it fatally, leaving it unable to respond to the other crises that followed. The Western hypothesis. Beyond the edges of the literate Bronze Age world, in lands where no scribes recorded events and no kings proclaimed their victories, archaeological evidence suggests massive population movements that may have contributed to the collapse. From Central Europe to the Western Mediterranean, a martial culture was expanding, bringing new technologies, new fighting techniques, and possibly the warriors who would become some of the sea peoples. This is the Urnfield phenomenon, named for their practice of cremating their dead and burying the ashes in ceramic urns, and their expansion coincides precisely with the Eastern Mediterranean's darkest hour. The Urnfield culture emerged in the Danube Valley around 1300 BC and spread rapidly westward and southward. By 1200 BC, Urnfield material culture appeared from Poland to Spain, from Denmark to Italy. This was not peaceful diffusion, but aggressive expansion. Hill forts were constructed and destroyed. Weapons caches were buried, perhaps as offerings to gods of war, perhaps as emergency supplies that were never retrieved. The Tollens Valley in northern Germany has yielded the remains of a battle involving thousands of warriors, their bronze weapons, and wooden clubs scattered among bones, showing clear evidence of violent death. This was warfare on a scale that matches anything from the civilized East. In the Western Mediterranean, this period saw dramatic changes that mirror the chaos in the East. Sardinia's Nuraghi builders shifted from constructing towers to producing bronze figurines of warriors, their horned helmets identical to those worn by the Sherden in Egyptian reliefs. Sicily's settlements moved from coastal plains to defensible hilltops. The Balearic Islands developed a warrior culture centered on sling warfare that would make them feared mercenaries for centuries to come. Southern Iberia saw the rise of fortified settlements that controlled river valleys and mountain passes. Everyone was preparing for war, or perhaps already fighting it. The evidence for Western involvement in the Sea People's invasions remains circumstantial but compelling. The bronze working techniques that appear suddenly in the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BC have their closest parallels in Italy and southern France. The Naue Type II swords that revolutionized warfare originated in northern Italy before spreading across Europe and into the collapsing Bronze Age kingdoms. Some of the pottery styles associated with the Sea Peoples have better parallels in the western Mediterranean than in the Aegean. The round shields and horned helmets depicted at Medinet Habu appear in rock art from Iberia to Scandinavia. Consider the journey from Sardinia to Egypt, a distance of roughly 1,500 miles by sea. With the navigation techniques and ship technology available in the late Bronze Age, this voyage would have taken perhaps 2 to 3 weeks with favourable winds. For comparison, Viking raiders in the 9th century AD regularly travelled similar distances, from Norway to Ireland or from Denmark to England. The western Mediterranean was not an isolated backwater, but part of an interconnected maritime world. When that world began to collapse, when trade goods stopped flowing and established powers weakened, the warriors of the West would have been drawn eastward like moths to a flame, seeking plunder, land, and opportunity in the ruins of the palace economies. The genetic evidence, though limited, supports some Western contribution to the Sea People's phenomenon. Ancient DNA from Philistine burials shows not just Aegean ancestry, but a broader European component that could have originated anywhere from Italy to the Balkans. The distribution of certain genetic markers in modern populations suggests ancient migration routes that led from the western Mediterranean through the Aegean to the Levant. While not conclusive, these patterns are consistent with the movement of peoples from west to east during the late Bronze Age collapse. Part 7. Modern Legacy and Continued Mysteries. Genetic Echoes. In a sterile laboratory in Leipzig in 2019 AD, scientists carefully extract DNA from a tooth that last chewed food 3,000 years ago. The tooth belonged to an infant buried in the Philistine city of Ashkelon, laid to rest with ceramic vessels and bronze jewellery that mark the grave as elite, someone whose family could afford proper burial goods, even for a child who never lived to use them. When the genetic sequences finally appear on computer screens, they reveal a truth that stone and pottery could only hint at. This child's ancestors had travelled very far indeed to reach this Levantine shore. The DNA tells a story of migration, written in chemical letters across chromosomes. Approximately 14% of this infant's ancestry derived from southern Europe, genes that had no business being in the Levant before the 12th century BC. The genetic signature matches populations from Greece, Western Anatolia, Sardinia, and the Iberian Peninsula, a broad swathe of the Mediterranean world that aligns remarkably well with the proposed origins of various sea peoples. This was not the DNA of a single foreign merchant or mercenary who had married into the local population, but evidence of substantial population movement, enough newcomers to shift the genetic landscape of an entire region. Yet the genetic story also reveals how quickly these newcomers integrated with local populations. By testing individuals from different time periods, scientists can trace the dilution of European ancestry generation by generation. Within 2 centuries of the initial arrival, the foreign genetic component had been reduced by half through intermarriage with the indigenous Canaanite population. The Philistines, those biblical enemies of Israel who seemed so foreign and threatening to their neighbours, were becoming genetically indistinguishable from those very neighbours. Cultural identity persisted long after genetic distinctiveness faded, a reminder that ethnicity in the ancient world was as much about shared practices and beliefs as biological ancestry. The genetic evidence from other sites tells similar stories of mixture and integration. In Lebanon, sudden appearances of European ancestry coincide with the establishment of new cities in the early Iron Age. In Cyprus, the genetic landscape shows waves of immigration from both east and west, consistent with the island's role as a gathering point for the Sea People's invasions. Even in Egypt, analysis of mummies from the period following the invasions shows increased genetic diversity, suggesting that Ramesses III's claim to have settled the defeated Sea Peoples in Egyptian territory was more than royal propaganda. Modern population genetics reveals echoes of these ancient migrations in living peoples. Certain genetic markers associated with Bronze Age European populations appear at higher frequencies along the exact routes the Sea Peoples are thought to have travelled. The people of Gaza, where the Philistine city of the same name once stood, carry genetic signatures that distinguish them from neighbouring populations, faint echoes of those ancient arrivals. Sardinians, long isolated on their island, preserve genetic patterns that may reflect the population that produced the Sherden warriors. The Lycaean coast of Turkey, homeland of the piratical Lukka, shows genetic continuity stretching back to the Bronze Age, suggesting that some sea peoples never left their original territories. But genetics can only tell us so much. It confirms that massive population movements occurred, that people from the western and central Mediterranean reached the eastern shores in significant numbers, that they integrated with local populations rather than replacing them. It cannot tell us why they came, whether as conquerors or refugees, whether they caused the collapse or were fleeing from it. The genes are silent on matters of motivation, identity, and experience. They tell us that the journey happened, but not what it meant to those who made it. The Dark Age dawn. You wake to a world transformed, though you do not yet know it. The year is 1100 BC, and you are a potter in what was once the Mycenaean kingdom of Pylos. Your grandfather served the palace, creating vessels according to strict specifications, receiving rations in return. Your father saw the palace burn, fled with his family to the hills, survived the years of chaos that followed. Now you shape clay with techniques passed down through generations, but you decorate them with new patterns learned from strangers who speak with foreign accents. There is no palace to serve, no scribes to record your work, no king to demand standardization. You trade directly with farmers, fishermen, and the strange new warriors who have built a rough fort where the palace once stood. This is freedom, though it comes at the price of everything your civilization once achieved. The Dark Age that followed the Bronze Age collapse was not uniformly dark, though it certainly seemed so to those who remembered what had been lost. Literacy vanished from Greece for 400 years. The art of monumental construction was forgotten. Trade networks that had connected Britain to Afghanistan dissolved into purely local exchange. Population levels crashed to perhaps a tenth of late Bronze Age heights. Cities were abandoned, their stones robbed for humbler buildings, their locations sometimes forgotten entirely. The Greece that would eventually produce Homer, Plato, and Aristotle first had to endure centuries where the highest ambition was mere survival. Yet from this darkness came innovations that would shape the future. Ironworking, once a closely guarded secret of a few specialists, became widespread as bronze became impossible to produce in quantity. Iron tools were inferior to bronze at first, but iron ore was everywhere, democratizing both agriculture and warfare. The alphabet, invented at Ugarit just before its destruction, was preserved and transmitted by Phoenician traders who emerged from the coastal cities that survived the collapse. Without palace bureaucracies to maintain rigid social hierarchies, new forms of political organization emerged, including the early experiments in collective governance that would eventually become Greek democracy. The Sea Peoples, whoever they truly were, vanished into this new world, their distinct identities dissolving within a few generations. The Philistines became just another Canaanite people, distinguished only by their uncircumcised state and their lingering reputation for martial prowess. The Sherden disappeared into the Egyptian military establishment, their descendants becoming as Egyptian as any native of the Nile. The Lukka continued their piracy under the name Lycians, eventually becoming just another Anatolian people absorbed into successive empires. Only their names survived, preserved in Egyptian stone and biblical text, enigmatic reminders of the forces that had reshaped the world. The recovery, when it came, was slow and uneven. Egypt retreated into itself, never again to be a major international power until the Ptolemaic period. The Assyrians, one of the few Bronze Age powers to survive intact, gradually expanded into the vacuum, creating an empire more brutal, but also more efficient than anything the Bronze Age had known. The Phoenicians, sailing from their surviving cities of Tyre and Sidon, re-established trade networks, founding colonies from Cyprus to Spain, eventually creating Carthage, Rome's great rival. The Greeks, emerging from their dark age with stories of ancient glory and modern ambition, would create a civilization that still shapes our world today. In Israel, a new people emerged, defined not by palace culture or bronze weapons, but by a radical religious idea, monotheism. Some scholars suggest that the social upheavals of the collapse, the mixing of peoples and traditions, created the conditions for this theological revolution. The biblical accounts of judges and early kings preserve memories of a time when centralized authority had failed, when communities had to organize themselves, when divine law mattered more than royal decree. The Israelites' enemies, those Philistines who may have been Peleset sea peoples, served as the necessary antagonist against which Israelite identity crystallized. The archaeological record of the early Iron Age reveals a world simultaneously impoverished and innovative. Sites that had been abandoned for generations were reoccupied by people who built with rough stones instead of dressed masonry, who buried their dead with local pottery instead of imported luxury goods, who worshipped at simple shrines instead of monumental temples. Yet these same people were experimenting with new technologies, new social organizations, new ways of understanding the world. The collapse had cleared away not just palaces and cities, but also the mental structures that had constrained human development. The catastrophe of the Sea People's era, devastating as it was, had created space for new possibilities. The Dark Age was ending, though those living through it could not have known. By 900 BC, writing was returning to Greece, borrowed from the Phoenicians but adapted to Greek needs. Trade was resuming, tentatively at first, then with increasing confidence. Cities were being founded or refounded, their walls built with memories of ancient violence and hope for future peace. The stories of the Bronze Age were being transformed into the epic poetry that would inspire Alexander, Caesar, and countless others. The Sea Peoples had passed into legend, their historical reality obscured by myth, their role in ending one world and beginning another, largely forgotten until modern archaeology began to recover their traces. Synthesis. We began this journey with a paradox. Civilizations powerful enough to leave monuments that would endure for millennia, yet fragile enough to vanish within a single generation. Now, having walked through the ashes of Ugarit, stood with Ramesses III at Medinet Habu, and traced the wanderings of displaced peoples across the Mediterranean, we understand that the Sea Peoples were both destroyers and destroyed, conquerors and refugees, the ending of one world and the beginning of another. They were not a unified force with a single origin or destiny, but a phenomenon born from the convergence of climate catastrophe, systems collapse, and human desperation. Like ocean waves that appear solid and singular from shore, but are actually composed of countless individual water molecules, each following its own complex path. The Sea Peoples were thousands of individual stories of survival that history has compressed into a single name: legacy. The physical traces of the Sea Peoples remain visible across the Mediterranean landscape for those who know where to look. In the ancient tells of the Philistine Pentapolis, archaeologists continue to uncover pottery that speaks of Aegean origins adapted to Levantine soil, each sherd a fragment of a story that began in a distant homeland and ended in a new world. The bronze figurines of Sardinian warriors still stand in museums, their horned helmets frozen in eternal vigilance, perhaps crafted by the same hands that once wielded swords against Egyptian shields. On Cyprus, the massive stones of Cyclopean walls still bear the marks of hasty construction built by people who knew that the sea could bring death as easily as trade. Even the languages we speak carry their echoes. The word Palestine itself derives from the Peleset, those feathered warriors who became the Philistines, ensuring that every time we name that troubled land, we invoke the memory of the Sea Peoples. Yet perhaps the most profound legacy of the Sea Peoples lies not in what they left behind, but in the lesson their story teaches about the fragility of complexity. The Bronze Age palace system, with its specialized craftsmen, professional scribes, and centralized control, had seemed the pinnacle of human achievement. It had lasted for centuries, growing ever more sophisticated, ever more interconnected, but that very interconnection became its weakness. When the climate shifted, when the earth shook, when desperate peoples began to move, the system had no resilience, no redundancy, no ability to adapt. The Dark Age that followed was not just a period of poverty and ignorance, but a necessary reset, a clearing away of rigid structures that had become too brittle to bend. From that darkness emerged new ideas about human organization, individual agency, and political participation that would ultimately prove more enduring than any Bronze Age palace. The Sea Peoples, in their very rootlessness and desperation, had inadvertently created the space for democracy, monotheism, and the individual to emerge from the ashes of divine kingship and palace bureaucracy. It's been my privilege to walk with you through the corridors of history, to stand together at that pivotal moment when the ancient world transformed into something new. The story of the Sea Peoples reminds us that history is not a simple narrative of progress, but a complex weaving of creation and destruction, of endings that become beginnings. Let these ancient stories guide you to restful sleep.